After my husband died, his kids said, "We want the estate, the business, everything." My lawyer begged me to fight. I said, "Give it all to them." Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. The kids smiled, until their lawyer turned pale when he read. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The funeral flowers were still fresh when they decided to destroy me. I sat in Floyd's leather chair in his home office, the same chair where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing business documents and planning our future together. 22 years of marriage. And now I was supposed to pretend that the two men standing before me had any right to decide my fate. Sidney, Floyd's eldest son, wore his father's death like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored to his advantage. At 45, he possessed the same commanding presence Floyd once had, but none of the warmth. His steel-gray eyes swept over me with the cold calculation of a businessman evaluating a bad investment. "Colleen," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate over the years. "We need to discuss some practical matters." Edwin, 3 years younger, but somehow looking older with his prematurely thinning hair and soft jaw, stood beside his brother like a loyal lieutenant. Where Sidney was sharp edges and calculated moves, Edwin was passive aggression wrapped in false concern. "We know this is difficult," Edwin added, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "Losing Dad so suddenly, it's been hard on all of us." Hard on all of us. As if they'd been the ones holding Floyd's hand during those long nights in the hospital. As if they'd been the ones making impossible decisions about treatments and pain management. They'd shown up for the funeral, of course. Sidney flying in from his law practice in San Francisco. Edwin driving up from Los Angeles where he ran some vague consulting business. But during the 3 months of Floyd's illness, when it really mattered, I'd been alone. "What kind of practical matters?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Sidney exchanged a look with Edwin, a silent communication perfected over decades of shared secrets and mutual understanding. It was the kind of look that excluded everyone else in the room, everyone like me. "The estate," Sidney said simply. "Dad's assets, the properties, the business interests. We need to sort out how everything will be distributed." I felt my fingers tighten around the arms of Floyd's chair. The leather was worn smooth from years of his hands in the same position, and I found comfort in that familiar texture. Floyd and I discussed this extensively. He assured me that everything was taken care of. "Well, yes," Edwin said, his tone suggesting that I was missing something obvious. Dad did make provisions, but perhaps he didn't explain the full complexity of the situation. Sidney pulled out a manila folder from his briefcase and set it on Floyd's desk, the same desk where Floyd had kissed me goodbye every morning for 22 years. The folder was thick, official-looking, intimidating in the way that legal documents always were. "The will is quite clear," Sidney continued, opening the folder with theatrical precision. "The house here in Sacramento, valued at approximately $850,000, goes to Edwin and myself jointly. The villa at Lake Tahoe, $750,000, also goes to us. The business assets, roughly $400,000, will be distributed between us as well." Each number hit me like a physical blow. Our home, the place where Floyd and I had built our life together, where we'd hosted Christmas dinners and anniversary parties, where we'd talked about growing old together, gone. The villa where we'd spent our honeymoon, where we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary, where Floyd had told me he loved me for the first time, gone. "And what about me?" I asked quietly. Edwin shifted uncomfortably, but Sidney's expression remained unchanged. "Well, naturally, there's the life insurance policy. $200,000. That should be more than sufficient for your needs going forward. $200,000 for a 63-year-old woman who'd given up her career to support her husband's family. For someone who'd spent the last 2 decades managing Floyd's household, entertaining his business associates, caring for him through his illness. $200,000 to start over. I see, I said, though I didn't see it all. This couldn't be right. Floyd had promised me that I'd be taken care of, that I'd never have to worry about security or stability. It's not personal, Colleen, Edwin said, and the false gentleness in his voice made my skin crawl. It's just that Dad always intended for the family assets to stay within the bloodline, you understand. Bloodline. As if the 22 years I'd spent as Floyd's wife, as Sydney and Edwin's stepmother, meant nothing. As if love and commitment were somehow less valid than genetics. Of course, Sydney added, we're not heartless. You can stay in the house for 30 days while you make arrangements. We think that's more than fair. Fair. They thought 30 days to uproot a life was fair. I looked around the office, taking in the familiar details that would soon belong to someone else. The bookshelf where Floyd kept his first edition novels, the window that looked out onto the garden we'd planned together, the small photograph on his desk, not of Sydney or Edwin, but of Floyd and me on our wedding day, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. There is one more thing, Sydney said, and something in his tone made me look up sharply. He pulled another document from the folder, this one smaller but somehow more ominous. Dad accumulated some significant medical bills during his final illness. The insurance covered most of it, but there's still about $180,000 outstanding. Since you were his wife and presumably made medical decisions jointly, the hospital and doctors are looking to you for payment. The room seemed to spin slightly. $180,000 in debt, with only $200,000 from the life insurance to cover it. That would leave me with $20,000 to rebuild my entire life. But surely the estate, I began. The estate assets are tied up in probate, Edwin interrupted smoothly. And given the specific terms of the will, those debts are considered separate from the inherited properties. It's unfortunate, but that's how these things work legally. I stared at them both, these 2 men who'd called me Mom at their father's funeral just 3 days ago. Sydney with his perfectly pressed suit and cold eyes. Edwin with his soft features and voice that suggested concern while delivering cruelty. I need some time to process this, I said finally. Of course, Sydney said, standing and straightening his jacket. Take all the time you need. But remember, the 30-day clock starts tomorrow. And those medical bills. Well, the longer they sit, the more complicated things become. They left me alone in Floyd's office, surrounded by the ghosts of our life together and the crushing weight of my new reality. The silence was deafening. No comfort, no reassurance, no suggestion that perhaps we could work together to find a solution that honored both Floyd's wishes and my basic human need for security. I sat there as the afternoon light shifted across the room, creating shadows that seemed to mock the brightness Floyd and I had once shared here. My hands found the small drawer in Floyd's desk where he'd always kept his personal items. Inside, beneath old receipts and business cards, my fingers touched something unexpected, a small key I'd never seen before. The key was old brass, worn smooth with handling. It didn't fit any lock I could think of in the house, but Floyd had kept it in his most private space. Why? As I held the key up to the light, I noticed Edwin's car was still in the driveway. Through the window, I could see him and Sydney standing beside it, their heads close together in animated conversation. They were celebrating, I realized, dividing up their inheritance, planning what they'd do with their newfound wealth. Neither of them looked back at the house where their stepmother, their father's wife, sat alone with the ruins of her life spread out before her. But as I watched them drive away, something strange happened. Instead of the despair I expected to feel, a different emotion began to take root. It started small, just a whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully erased me from Floyd's legacy, reduced me to nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed with the minimum legal requirements. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Floyd had always been more cunning than either of his sons realized. And after 22 years of marriage, some of that cunning had rubbed off on me. The key in my hand seemed to grow warmer as I held it, as if it were trying to tell me something. Tomorrow I would find out what lock it opened. Tonight, I would let Sydney and Edwin enjoy their victory. Martin Morrison had been Floyd's attorney for 15 years, and in all that time, I'd never seen him look as uncomfortable as he did sitting across from me in his downtown office. His usually perfect composure was cracked, revealing the concerned man beneath the professional facade. "Colleen," he said, removing his glasses and cleaning them for the third time in 10 minutes. "I have to advise you in the strongest possible terms. This is not the right decision." The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 15th floor office, casting everything in sharp relief. The Sacramento River glittered below us, and somewhere in those gleaming office buildings across the water, people were making rational decisions about their lives. I envied them. "I understand your concerns, Martin," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But my mind is made up." He set his glasses down and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You could fight this. The will. There are irregularities, questions about Floyd's mental state during the final revision. We could contest it, delay probate, force Sydney and Edwin to negotiate." I'd spent the sleepless night reading and rereading the documents Sydney had left with me, trying to understand how Floyd, my Floyd, could have written me out of our shared life so completely. The language was cold, clinical, reducing 22 years of marriage to a few paragraphs about adequate provision and appropriate arrangements. "How long would a contest take?" I asked. "Months, possibly years. But Colleen, you'd have a real chance. I know Floyd, and this will. It doesn't match the man I knew. The man who spoke about you with such love and respect. Love and respect." Had I imagined all those conversations where Floyd assured me I'd be taken care of? Had I misunderstood his promises that I'd never have to worry about my future? And during those months or years, what would I live on? Sydney made it clear that the medical debts are my responsibility. $180,000, Martin. Even if I won a contest eventually, I'd be bankrupt long before then. Martin's jaw tightened. "Sydney and Edwin are playing hardball, but that's exactly why you shouldn't give them what they want. They're counting on you being too intimidated or too exhausted to fight." He was right, of course. Every instinct I had screamed that this was wrong, that Floyd had not intended to leave me with almost nothing while his sons inherited millions. But instincts didn't pay medical bills or put a roof over my head. "What if I just gave them everything they want?" I asked quietly. Martin blinked. "I'm sorry? What if I signed whatever papers they need, transferred all claims to the properties, walked away cleanly? How quickly could that be done?" "Colleen, you can't be serious. You'd be giving up your legal rights to challenge." "How quickly, Martin?" He stared at me for a long moment, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. "If you waived all claims and signed the proper releases, a week, maybe 2. But why would you even consider that?" I looked out at the river again, watching a small boat navigate the current. The boat's captain seemed to know exactly where he was going, following some invisible map that guided him safely to his destination. "Because fighting would destroy me," I said finally. "Even if I won, I'd be a different person by the end of it. Bitter, exhausted, broke. Maybe it's better to accept what's offered and build something new. Martin leaned back in his chair, studying me with the intense focus that had made him one of Sacramento's most successful attorneys. Colleen, in 30 years of practice, I've never had a client voluntarily walk away from a 7-figure inheritance. There has to be something I'm missing here. There was something he was missing, but I couldn't explain it to him. Couldn't explain the certainty that had grown in me since finding Floyd's mysterious key. All night, I'd searched the house for what it might unlock, checking every drawer, every cabinet, every storage space I could think of. Nothing. But the key felt important. Felt like Floyd trying to communicate something from beyond the grave. Maybe I'm just tired, I said. Tired of fighting? Tired of being seen as the greedy stepmother who wants to steal the son's inheritance. Maybe it's easier to let them have what they think they deserve. What they think they deserve. Martin's voice sharpened. Colleen, this isn't about what they deserve. This is about what Floyd intended. And I'm telling you as his attorney and friend, this will doesn't reflect his true wishes. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Mrs. Whitaker, this is Edwin. Could we meet today to discuss timeline for property transfer? Want to make this as smooth as possible for everyone involved. The politeness was almost worse than Sydney's cold directness. At least Sydney didn't pretend to care about making things smooth for me. They're already planning the transfer, I said, showing Martin the message. His face darkened. They're rushing you. Classic pressure tactic. Colleen, I'm begging you to reconsider. Take time to grieve, to process what you've lost. Don't make irreversible decisions while you're in shock. But I wasn't in shock anymore. The numbness that had carried me through Floyd's illness and death was lifting, replaced by something that felt almost like clarity. I couldn't fight Sydney and Edwin with their lawyers and their sense of entitlement and their intimate knowledge of Floyd's business affairs. But maybe I didn't need to fight them directly. If I were to sign the papers, I said slowly, what exactly would I be signing away? Martin sighed heavily, recognizing defeat. All claims to the primary residence, the Lake Tahoe property, the business assets, any joint accounts or investments. You'd retain only the life insurance payout and any personal property that was specifically yours before the marriage. And in exchange? They'd agree to handle the medical debts from the estate funds before distribution. You'd walk away clear of those obligations. That was something, at least. It would leave me with the full $200,000 instead of just $20,000 after debt payments. Still not enough for long-term security, but enough to survive while I figured out what came next. I need to see the exact language, I said. Martin opened his laptop and began typing. I'll draft something that protects your interests as much as possible under the circumstances. But Colleen, once you sign this, there's no going back. You'll have no legal recourse if you later discover information that would have changed your decision. I understand. But even as I said it, I wondered if I really did understand. The key in my purse seemed to grow heavier, a constant reminder that Floyd had left me something, some message or instruction that I hadn't yet deciphered. Was I making a terrible mistake by giving up so easily? Or was I being guided by an instinct that ran deeper than logic? My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sydney. Mother, we appreciate your cooperation in this difficult time. Edwin and I want to make the transition as painless as possible. Perhaps we could finalize everything by the end of the week. Mother. He called me Mother when he wanted something, but it rang hollow now. Where had that familial concern been during Floyd's final months when I'd sat alone in hospital waiting rooms? They want everything signed by the end of the week, I told Martin. Of course they do. The faster they can get your signature, the less time you have to change your mind or seek a second opinion. He looked at me intently. Colleen, there's something about this whole situation that feels wrong to me. Sydney and Edwin are acting like they're afraid you might discover something that would complicate their inheritance. Men don't typically rush through probate unless they have reason to worry. That thought had occurred to me too. In all the years I'd known Sydney and Edwin, they'd never been particularly efficient or urgent about anything. Sydney was methodical to a fault, and Edwin was positively leisurely in his approach to business. This sudden push for quick resolution felt out of character. Maybe they're just eager to move on, I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Or maybe they know something you don't. Martin closed his laptop and leaned forward again. Colleen, I'm going to ask you one more time. Will you at least take 48 hours to think about this? Sleep on it. Talk to a friend, a counselor, someone who isn't emotionally invested in the outcome. I almost laughed. A friend? Floyd and I had been each other's best friends for 22 years. We'd let other friendships fade as we'd focused on building our life together, entertaining his business associates, managing his household. I'd been Floyd's wife, Sydney and Edwin's stepmother, but I'd never quite figured out who I was as an individual woman. I don't need 48 hours, I said. I've already decided. Martin studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll draft the papers, but I want everything in writing. Their agreement to handle the medical debts, a clear timeline for when you'll receive the insurance payout, and a clause that protects you from any future claims related to Floyd's estate. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm about to help you make what might be the biggest mistake of your life. As I left Martin's office and walked through the marble lobby toward the elevator, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished walls. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Older, certainly, but also somehow more solid, more present. For 22 years, I'd been Floyd's wife, defined by my relationship to him and to his sons. For the first time since his death, I was being forced to figure out who Colleen Morrison Whitaker was when stripped of those roles. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. As we descended toward the parking garage, I touched the key in my purse one more time. Floyd had left me something, I was sure of it, and whatever it was, Sydney and Edwin didn't know about it. The key opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank on J Street, a box I never knew existed. I'd spent 2 days methodically searching every inch of our house, growing more frustrated with each empty drawer and meaningless cabinet. It wasn't until I was going through Floyd's wallet, the one the hospital had returned with his personal effects, that I found the small business card tucked behind his driver's license. First National Bank, with a handwritten number on the back, 379. The bank manager, a kind woman named Patricia who remembered Floyd from his occasional visits, led me down to the vault with appropriate sympathy. Mr. Whitaker was very specific about this box, she said as we descended the marble steps. Only you and he had access. He opened it about 6 months ago. 6 months ago. Right around the time Floyd's health had started declining, when he'd begun having those mysterious business meetings that he'd never quite explained to me. The box was larger than I'd expected, and heavier. Patricia left me alone in the small viewing room, and with trembling fingers, I lifted the metal lid. Inside were documents, lots of them. But these weren't the legal papers I'd expected, wills or insurance policies or business contracts. These were personal letters, printed emails, financial statements, and what looked like surveillance reports. The first thing that caught my eye was a letter in Floyd's handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death. The envelope was marked, "For Colleen, open only after reading everything else." I set that aside and picked up the next document, a printed email exchange between Sydney and someone named Marcus Crawford. The timestamp showed it was from 8 months ago, and as I read, my blood grew cold. Marcus, Dad's getting worse. The doctors think he's got maybe 6 months. We need to move faster on the transfer protocols. Can you expedite the paperwork we discussed? The reply was equally chilling. Sydney, I've prepared the documents as requested. Once your father signs, the business assets will be restructured under the shell companies we established. The personal properties can be transferred immediately upon death. What about the wife? Colleen won't be a problem. She doesn't understand the business side, and by the time she figures out what's happening, it'll be too late. Dad trusts us completely. I had to read it twice before the meaning sank in. They'd been planning this for months. While I was caring for Floyd, driving him to doctor appointments, managing his medications, his sons were plotting to steal not just from me, but from their own father. The next document was a bank statement for an account I'd never heard of. Whitaker Holdings, LLC. The balance showed $4.7 million. Below it was a handwritten note from Floyd. Colleen, this is our real savings. The boys think all my money is tied up in the house and business, but I moved the bulk of our assets here months ago. I was trying to protect us. $4.7 million. We weren't poor. We weren't even middle class. Floyd had been quietly wealthy, and Sydney and Edwin had been trying to steal from their dying father. My hands shook as I reached for the next item, a folder labeled Private Investigation Confidential. Inside were photographs, financial records, and a summary report from someone named James Mitchell, licensed private investigator. The photos showed Sydney entering and leaving what appeared to be an upscale casino in Reno. The timestamps indicated he'd made multiple trips over the past year, sometimes staying for several days. The financial records painted an even grimmer picture. Sydney owed $230,000 to various creditors, most of them connected to gambling debts. Edwin's file was just as damning. The investigation had uncovered that his consulting business was actually a front for a series of failed investment schemes. He'd lost nearly $300,000 of other people's money, including funds that belonged to several elderly clients who'd trusted him with their retirement savings. Both of Floyd's sons were drowning in debt and legal troubles. No wonder they were so eager to get their hands on their inheritance. But the most devastating document was a medical report dated 3 months before Floyd's death. It wasn't from his regular doctor. This was from a neurologist I'd never heard of. The summary was brief but conclusive. Patient shows no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. Mental faculties remain sharp and decision-making ability intact. Sydney and Edwin had been suggesting to anyone who would listen that Floyd's illness was affecting his judgment, that he wasn't capable of making sound decisions about his estate. But this report proved otherwise. Floyd had been completely mentally competent right up until the end. The final document in the folder was a copy of a different will, not the one Sydney had shown me, but one dated just 6 weeks before Floyd's death. This will left everything to me, with modest trust funds for Sydney and Edwin that would pay out annually, but couldn't be accessed all at once. A note in the margin, in Floyd's handwriting, read, "Original held by Mitchell and Associates, not Morrison Firm." My heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. There were 2 wills. Sydney and Edwin had somehow gained access to an older version and were using it to claim their inheritance, while the real final will was safely hidden with a different law firm. But why hadn't this Mitchell and Associates contacted me after Floyd's death? Why was I only discovering this now? I reached for Floyd's letter with trembling hands and carefully opened the envelope. "My dearest Colleen," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and the boys have shown their true colors. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about all of this while I was alive, but I needed to be sure of what they were planning." The letter went on to explain how Floyd had grown suspicious when Sydney and Edwin suddenly became so attentive during his illness. Not out of love, but because they were positioning themselves to control his estate. He'd hired the private investigator, moved the money, and created the elaborate plan to protect me. The boys think they're inheriting the house and the business. But what they don't know is that I've mortgaged both properties heavily in the past year. The house has a $1.2 million lien against it, and the business owes $800,000 to creditors. They're not inheriting assets. They're inheriting debt. I stared at the letter, hardly believing what I was reading. Floyd had essentially given Sydney and Edwin a poison pill, disguised as an inheritance. The life insurance policy they mentioned is real, the letter continued. But it's not for $200,000. It's for $500,000, and the extra money is meant to help you start over. Martin Morrison was never supposed to handle my estate. I fired his firm 2 months ago but didn't tell him. The boys must have convinced him to represent the family after my death. The final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. I know this seems cruel, but I couldn't stand by and watch them steal from you the way they've been stealing from everyone else. They made their choices, Colleen. Now they have to live with the consequences. You deserve better than what they were planning to give you. Take the money, start fresh, and don't look back. Love always, Floyd. Attached to the letter was a business card for Mitchell and Associates and a note that I should contact them immediately after reading the contents of the safety deposit box. I sat in that small, windowless room for nearly an hour, trying to process everything I'd learned. Floyd hadn't abandoned me. He'd been protecting me. And Sydney and Edwin, the men who'd called me mother at the funeral, who'd spoken so eloquently about family and legacy, were nothing more than common thieves. But there was something else, something that made my stomach churn. If Sydney and Edwin were so desperate for money that they'd steal from their dying father, what would they do when they discovered their inheritance was actually a mountain of debt? Would they come after me? Would they try to force me to help them out of the financial hole Floyd had dug for them? I carefully placed all the documents back in the safety deposit box except for the business card and Floyd's letter. Those I tucked safely in my purse. Tomorrow I would call Mitchell and Associates and find out exactly what Floyd had arranged. But tonight, I had to sit through dinner with Sydney and Edwin, knowing what I now knew about them. I had to smile and nod while they discussed their plans for our properties, pretending I didn't know they were about to inherit nothing but debt and legal troubles. As I drove home, my phone rang. It was Edwin. "Colleen," he said, his voice warm with false affection. "Bianca and I would love to have you over for dinner tonight. We thought it would be nice to spend some family time together before we finalize all the legal matters." Family time. How thoughtful of them. "That sounds lovely," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What time?" 7 o'clock, and Colleen, we really want you to know how much we appreciate how gracefully you're handling everything. Dad would be proud. Dad would be proud. If Edwin only knew what Dad had really thought about his gambling-addicted, debt-ridden sons. As I hung up and continued driving toward what would probably be my last dinner as a member of the Whitaker family, I realized something had changed in me. The grief and confusion I'd been carrying since Floyd's death were still there, but they were now mixed with something else. Something harder and more focused. Sydney and Edwin thought they were so clever, manipulating the grieving widow, rushing me into decisions before I could think clearly. They had no idea that their father had been 10 steps ahead of them the entire time. And they certainly had no idea that I was about to be 10 steps ahead of them, too. Dinner was going to be very interesting indeed. Edwin and Bianca's house in Granite Bay was a monument to borrowed money and false success. As I pulled into their circular driveway, I couldn't help but notice the new luxury cars, a BMW and a Mercedes, that clearly cost more than most people made in a year. Now I understood where the money had come from. Bianca answered the door wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. At 38, she'd perfected the art of looking expensively maintained. Highlights that cost $600 every 8 weeks, nails that required weekly touch-ups, jewelry that sparkled with the kind of stones that came with insurance riders. "Colleen!" she exclaimed, pulling me into an air kiss that barely grazed my cheek. "You look wonderful. How are you holding up?" The concern in her voice was about as genuine as her nail color, but I smiled and played along. "I'm managing, dear. Thank you for having me." Sydney was already there, lounging in Edwin's study with a scotch in his hand that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The room was all dark wood and leather, designed to project success and stability. What it actually projected, now that I knew the truth, was desperate overreach. "Mother," Sydney said, standing to give me a brief hug. "You're looking better. I was worried about you after our conversation yesterday." Yesterday, when he'd told me I was essentially homeless and bankrupt. Such touching concern. Edwin emerged from the kitchen carrying a wine glass filled with what looked like a very expensive Chardonnay. "Colleen, so glad you could make it. Bianca's been cooking all afternoon. Her famous herb-crusted salmon." The three of them moved around me like gracious hosts, offering drinks and appetizers, commenting on my appearance, asking about my plans. It was a masterful performance of family concern, and if I hadn't spent the afternoon reading about their gambling debts and failed business ventures, I might have been touched. Dinner was served in their formal dining room, complete with china that looked like it belonged in a museum and silverware heavy enough to be weapons. Bianca had indeed outdone herself. The salmon was perfectly prepared, the wine expertly paired, the presentation flawless. "So," Sydney said as we settled into the main course, "Martin Morrison called me this afternoon. He mentioned you're ready to move forward with the estate transfer." I took a delicate bite of salmon, buying time. "Yes, I've decided that fighting over Floyd's wishes isn't how I want to spend my remaining years. Family harmony is more important than money." The relief that flickered across Edwin's face was almost comical. That's wonderful, Colleen. Really wonderful. Dad would be so pleased to know we're all working together." "We've prepared some papers," Bianca added, reaching for a manila folder that had been sitting on the sideboard. "Just to make everything official. Our attorney drew them up to complement what Martin is handling." Their attorney. Of course they'd brought in their own legal representation. I wondered if this mysterious lawyer knew about Sydney's gambling debts or Edwin's fraudulent investment schemes. "How thoughtful," I said, not touching the folder. "But I should mention that I've been doing some thinking about the medical bills." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sydney set down his wine glass with just a bit too much force. "What kind of thinking?" Edwin asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Well, $180,000 is a substantial amount. I was wondering if perhaps we should have an accountant review the estate's liquid assets before I commit to taking on that debt personally." Sydney and Edwin exchanged a look, the same kind of silent communication I'd witnessed in Floyd's office, but this time I could read the subtext. They were afraid I might discover something. "Colleen," Sydney said carefully, "I thought we'd explain that the estate assets are tied up in probate. The medical bills are separate from the inheritance." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "But Floyd was always so meticulous about his record-keeping. I'm sure there must be documentation of exactly what debts belong to the estate versus what's considered personal responsibility." Bianca laughed, the sound just a bit too bright. "Oh, Edwin handles all that boring financial stuff. Don't you, honey?" Edwin nodded rapidly. "Absolutely. Everything's been properly categorized. The medical expenses fall to you because you were Floyd's spouse and presumably involved in the treatment decisions." "That makes sense," I agreed. Although I do find it interesting that Floyd never mentioned being worried about medical costs. He always seemed so confident that we had adequate insurance. The silence stretched just a beat too long. Sydney cleared his throat. "Insurance doesn't cover everything, unfortunately. Dad's treatment was quite extensive in those final months." I knew I was walking into dangerous territory, but I couldn't resist pressing just a little. I suppose I should contact the hospital directly. Get an itemized breakdown of what's owed and what the insurance actually covered. Edwin's fork clattered against his plate. That's not necessary, Colleen. I've already handled all that. Very thoroughly. I'm sure you have, I said. But as Floyd's widow, I feel responsible for understanding exactly what happened financially during his final illness. It's the least I can do for his memory. Bianca jumped up suddenly. Who wants dessert? I made that chocolate torte recipe from Food and Wine magazine. She practically fled to the kitchen, and I didn't miss the meaningful look Sydney shot at Edwin. They were rattled, and I'd barely begun to probe. Colleen, Sydney said, leaning forward with what I supposed was meant to be a paternal expression. I hope you're not second-guessing our arrangement because of something someone else said. Sometimes people who aren't familiar with estate law can give misleading advice. Oh no, I assured him. I'm not second-guessing anything. I'm just trying to be thorough. Floyd always said that the devil was in the details. Edwin laughed nervously. Dad did love his paperwork. He certainly did. In fact, I've been going through his office, and I keep finding documents I don't understand. Bank statements for accounts I've never heard of. Business papers for companies I didn't know he was involved with. The color drained from Edwin's face. What kinds of documents? Oh, nothing important, I'm sure. Just confusing financial statements. Although I did find a safety deposit box key that I'd never seen before. Sydney went very still. A safety deposit box? Yes. Isn't that odd? I thought I knew about all of Floyd's financial arrangements, but apparently he had some accounts and boxes I wasn't aware of. I suppose I should look into those before we finalize everything. The look that passed between the brothers this time was pure panic, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Mother, Sydney said, his voice strained with the effort to sound casual. You shouldn't worry yourself with all that paperwork. Legal documents can be very confusing for someone without a business background. Why don't you let Edwin and me handle reviewing whatever you found? That's very sweet of you both, I said. But I think Floyd would want me to understand our financial situation myself. After all, I'll be managing on my own from now on. Bianca returned with the torte, her smile looking somewhat forced. As she served dessert, the conversation shifted to safer topics. The weather, Edwin's latest consulting project, Sydney's law practice. But I could feel the tension underneath their polite chatter like an electrical current waiting to spark. After dinner, as I prepared to leave, Sydney walked me to my car. Colleen, he said, his hand on my car door. About those documents you mentioned finding. Yes? It would probably be best if you brought them to our next meeting. Let us help you sort through what's important and what isn't. Dad's filing system wasn't always logical. I smiled at him, the same pleasant smile I'd worn all evening. Of course, Sydney. Family should help family. But as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, standing in the driveway with his phone already pressed to his ear. He was making a call that couldn't wait until he got back inside. By the time I reached home, my own phone was ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Whitaker? This is James Mitchell from Mitchell & Associates. I believe you may have some documents that belong to my office? Mr. Mitchell, I said, settling into Floyd's chair in his study. How did you know I'd found them? Your husband was very specific in his instructions. If you found the safety deposit box, I was to contact you within 24 hours. Ma'am, we need to meet as soon as possible. There are some things about your husband's estate that you need to know before you sign anything with Sydney and Edwin. What kinds of things? Things that will change everything, Mrs. Whitaker. Everything. As I hung up the phone and looked around Floyd's study, my study now, I realized that the invisible game I'd been playing all evening was about to become very visible indeed. Sydney and Edwin thought they were manipulating a grieving widow, But they had no idea that their father had been playing a much longer, much more sophisticated game. James Mitchell's office was nothing like Martin Morrison's polished downtown suite. Located in a modest building in Midtown Sacramento, it had the comfortable, lived-in feeling of a place where real work got done rather than impressive clients got courted. Mitchell himself was a surprise. A soft-spoken man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands that showed he'd worked for everything he'd earned. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, rising from behind a desk that was organized chaos incarnate. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit down. We have a lot to discuss." I settled into the worn leather chair across from his desk, my purse containing Floyd's letter held tightly in my lap. "Mr. Mitchell, I have to admit I'm confused about all of this. I didn't even know Floyd had hired another attorney." "He hired me about 8 months ago," Mitchell said, pulling out a thick file. "Initially, it was just to conduct a discreet investigation into some financial irregularities he'd noticed. But as we uncovered more information, my role expanded significantly." He opened the file, and I could see it contained copies of many of the same documents I'd found in the safety deposit box, along with others I hadn't seen. "Your husband was a very thorough man, Mrs. Whitaker. When he realized what his sons were planning, he developed a comprehensive strategy to protect you and ensure they faced consequences for their actions." "The investigation showed they were stealing from him?" Mitchell nodded grimly. Sidney had been forging his father's signature on loan documents, using the family business as collateral for his gambling debts. Edwin was worse. He'd been systematically transferring funds from client accounts into his own shell companies. Both of them were facing potential criminal charges if their activities came to light. I felt a chill settle over me. Criminal charges? Grand larceny, wire fraud, elder abuse. Your husband could have had them both arrested. Instead, he chose a more creative form of justice. Mitchell pulled out a different set of documents and spread them across his desk. "These are the real estate records for the house and the Lake Tahoe property. As of 6 months ago, both properties are leveraged to the maximum. Your husband took out mortgages totaling $1.2 million on the house and $800,000 on the villa. But why would he do that? We owned both properties free and clear. Because he knew Sidney and Edwin would inherit them, and he wanted to ensure they inherited the associated debts as well. The money from those mortgages? It's sitting safely in the Whitaker Holdings account that only you can access." My head spun as I tried to process what he was telling me. "So when they inherit the properties?" "They inherit properties worth approximately $1.6 million, but with mortgages totaling $2 million. They'll owe $600,000 more than the houses are worth." "That's not possible. They showed me the will." "They showed you an outdated will," Mitchell interrupted gently. "One that was superseded by a final version your husband executed 6 weeks before his death. The real will leaves everything to you, with the stipulation that if you choose, you can gift the properties to Sidney and Edwin. The choice is entirely yours." He handed me a copy of the real will. As I read through the legal language, one clause stood out. "I leave the decision of what, if anything, my sons Sidney and Edwin shall inherit entirely to my beloved wife Colleen, trusting in her wisdom and judgment to determine what they truly deserve." "Floyd left it up to me?" I whispered. "He did. And Mrs. Whitaker, there's more. The life insurance policy isn't for $200,000. It's for $500,000. And there's an additional policy for $300,000 that Sidney and Edwin don't know about. $800,000. Combined with the money Floyd had moved to the protected accounts, I wasn't just secure, I was wealthy. But here's the most important part," Mitchell continued. "Your husband documented everything. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, Every lie Sydney and Edwin told during his illness. If you choose to pursue criminal charges, we have more than enough evidence to ensure convictions. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the full scope of Floyd's plan became clear. He hadn't just protected me. He'd given me the power to decide Sydney and Edwin's fate. What happens if I don't pursue charges but also don't give them the properties? They get nothing. They inherit their father's love and their childhood memories, and that's all. Meanwhile, they're still facing the debts they've already accumulated, and the creditors who've been waiting for their inheritance to pay them back won't be very understanding. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Sydney. "Don't answer it," Mitchell advised. "Not yet. There are a few more things you need to know." But the phone kept ringing, and something in the persistence of it made me uneasy. Finally, I picked up. "Colleen?" Sydney's voice was strained, almost frantic. "We need to talk. There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Someone from Mitchell and Associates called Edwin this morning. They claim to have documents that supersede the will we've been working with. This is very concerning, Colleen. We think someone might be trying to defraud the estate." I looked at Mitchell, who was shaking his head with what might have been amusement. "Sydney, I don't understand. What kind of documents?" "Legal papers that don't make sense. Listen, Mother. I think you should come to Martin Morrison's office immediately. We need to sort this out before you sign anything or make any decisions you might regret." The urgency in his voice was telling. They'd discovered they weren't inheriting what they thought, and they were panicking. "I'll be there in an hour," I said, and hung up. Mitchell leaned back in his chair. "So, Mrs. Whitaker, the moment of truth has arrived. What do you want to do?" I stared down at the documents spread across his desk, evidence of years of manipulation and theft, proof of Floyd's careful planning, and the legal foundation for whatever choice I made next. "I want to understand something," I said slowly. "If I give them the properties with the mortgages, are they legally obligated to pay those debts?" "Absolutely. The mortgages transfer with the properties. They'd have 30 days to refinance or assume the loans, or face foreclosure. And given their existing debts and credit problems, no bank would refinance them. They'd lose the properties and still owe the deficiency balances." I thought about dinner the night before, about Bianca's designer dress and the expensive cars in their driveway, about Sydney's casual arrogance and Edwin's false concern. I thought about 22 years of being treated as an outsider in my own family, of being dismissed and patronized and ultimately betrayed. But mostly, I thought about Floyd, lying in that hospital bed, knowing what his sons were planning, working even in his final weeks to protect me from their greed. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, "I believe it's time for Sydney and Edwin to learn about the consequences of their choices." As I drove to Martin Morrison's office, my phone buzzed with a steady stream of increasingly desperate text messages. "Sydney, Mother, please don't sign anything until we sort this out." Edwin, "Colleen, there are people trying to take advantage of your grief. Be careful." Bianca, "We're all family here. Don't let strangers come between us." Family. They still thought they could manipulate me with that word, but as I pulled into the parking garage of Martin's building, I realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time in 22 years, I wasn't walking into a meeting as Floyd's wife or as Sydney and Edwin's stepmother. I was walking in as Colleen Whitaker, a woman with $5.7 million, complete legal documentation of her stepson's crimes, and the power to decide their future. The scared, grieving widow they thought they were manipulating had ceased to exist. In her place was someone much more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The conference room at Morrison and Associates had never felt so small. Sydney and Edwin sat on one side of the polished mahogany table, their faces pale but determined. Martin Morrison occupied the head of the table, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. James Mitchell sat beside me, a thick briefcase at his feet and the calm demeanor of a man who held all the cards. "Colleen," Sydney began before anyone else could speak, "we're glad you're here. This whole situation has gotten very confusing, and we need to clear up some misunderstandings." "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked, settling into my chair and folding my hands calmly in my lap. Edwin jumped in, his voice strained with false concern. "Someone's been spreading misinformation about Dad's estate, claims about different wills, hidden accounts, things that just don't make sense. We're worried that unscrupulous people might be trying to take advantage of your grief." Martin Morrison cleared his throat. "Colleen, I have to admit that I'm confused as well. Mr. Mitchell here claims to have documents that supersede the will I've been working with, but Floyd never mentioned changing attorneys or creating new estate documents." "That's because Floyd didn't trust you anymore," I said quietly. The room went dead silent. Martin's face flushed red, while Sydney and Edwin exchanged a look of pure panic. "Excuse me?" Martin said. I opened my purse and pulled out Floyd's letter, the one I'd found in the safety deposit box. "Floyd discovered that someone in your firm was feeding information about his estate planning to Sydney and Edwin. He couldn't be sure if it was you personally or someone in your office, so he decided to take his business elsewhere." "That's impossible," Sydney said quickly. "Dad trusted Martin completely." "Did he?" I looked directly at Sydney, enjoying the way his confident facade was beginning to crack. "Then why did he secretly hire a private investigator 8 months ago to look into your financial activities? And why did he move $4.7 million into accounts that only I can access?" Edwin made a choking sound. $4.7 million? That's not possible. Dad didn't have that kind of liquid assets. "Actually, he did," James Mitchell said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. "Your father was considerably wealthier than either of you realized. He'd been quietly building a portfolio for years, specifically to ensure Colleen's security after his death. He spread documents across the table, bank statements, investment records, property deeds. The house you think you're inheriting? It has a $1.2 million mortgage against it. The villa at Lake Tahoe? $800,000 in liens. Your father took out these loans specifically to saddle any inheritance with debt." Sydney's face had gone from pale to gray. "You're lying." "I'm afraid not," Mitchell continued calmly. "Your father documented everything very carefully, including your gambling debts, Sydney, $230,000 to various creditors, and Edwin's fraudulent investment schemes, which have cost his clients nearly $300,000. "This is harassment," Edwin said, his voice cracking. "You can't prove any of this." Mitchell smiled and pulled out another folder. "Actually, I can. Bank records showing forged signatures on loan documents, wire transfer records proving embezzlement, recorded phone conversations where both of you discussed manipulating your father's estate while he was dying in the hospital." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Martin Morrison was staring at the documents with the horrified expression of a man realizing he'd been completely played. "Colleen," Sydney said, his voice now openly desperate, "surely you don't believe these fabrications. We're family. We love you." "Family," I repeated. "The way you loved me when you told me I was inheriting $20,000 after 22 years of marriage. The way you loved me when you gave me 30 days to find somewhere else to live." Bianca, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "This is all just a misunderstanding. We can work this out. We can make adjustments." "Actually," I interrupted, "there's nothing to work out. The real will, the legally binding one, leaves everything to me. The choice of what, if anything, Sydney and Edwin inherit is entirely mine. I reached into my purse and pulled out another document. This is a gift deed I had prepared this morning. I'm giving you exactly what you tried to give me. Sydney grabbed the document and read it quickly, his face cycling through confusion, understanding, and finally horror. You're giving us the house and the villa, Edwin said slowly. But with the mortgages. That's correct. You'll own properties worth approximately $1.6 million, with associated debts of $2 million. That leaves you $600,000 in the hole, which seems fitting given your existing financial difficulties. You can't do this, Sydney said, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, I can. It's exactly what Floyd intended. He wanted you to face the consequences of your choices. Martin Morrison finally found his voice. Colleen, this is extremely irregular. Perhaps we should take some time to consider all options. No, I said firmly. I've considered everything. Sydney and Edwin can accept their inheritance as offered, or they can walk away with nothing. Those are their only options. And if we refuse? Edwin asked. James Mitchell answered. Then Mrs. Whitaker will pursue criminal charges for elder abuse, grand larceny, and wire fraud. The evidence is overwhelming. You'd both be looking at significant prison time. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I could see Sydney's mind working, trying to find an angle, a way to negotiate or manipulate the situation. Edwin just looked defeated. Finally, Sydney spoke. What do you want from us? I want you to sign the papers accepting the inheritance as offered. I want you to agree never to contact me again unless it's through attorneys. And I want you to understand that this is what your father chose for you, not out of hatred, but because you forced his hand. Bianca started crying. This will ruin us. We'll lose everything. You should have thought about that before you started stealing from your dying father, I said without sympathy. Edwin looked up at me with something that might have been respect. He really planned all of this? Every detail. Your father was much smarter than either of you ever gave him credit for. In the end, they signed. They didn't have a choice. The alternative was prison, and even in their desperation, they weren't quite ready to risk that. As they filed out of the conference room, Sydney paused at the door. This isn't over, Colleen. Yes, it is, I replied calmly. It's completely over. 3 months later, I sold the real estate that Sydney and Edwin couldn't afford to keep and moved to a charming cottage in Carmel, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The cottage cost $1.2 million, cash, and still left me with more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. I received word through my attorney that Sydney had filed for bankruptcy and was attending court-mandated gambling addiction counseling. Edwin had moved back in with his mother and was working as a night manager at a hotel near the airport. Bianca had filed for divorce and moved to Los Angeles with her sister. Sometimes, usually in the evening when the fog rolled in from the ocean, I would think about Floyd and wonder if he would approve of how everything had turned out. Then I would remember his letter, his careful planning, his determination to protect me even after death. I think he would have been very satisfied indeed. The cottage came with a beautiful garden that the previous owners had neglected. I spent my days bringing it back to life, planting roses like the ones Floyd and I had grown together, creating herb gardens and flower beds that bloomed in carefully planned succession throughout the year. It was peaceful work, satisfying in a way that 22 years of managing other people's expectations had never been. For the first time in my adult life, I was accountable to no one but myself. I joined the local gardening club, took watercolor classes at the community college, and even started volunteering at the animal shelter. Simple pleasures, but they felt revolutionary after decades of living my life in service to others' needs and wants. One afternoon, while deadheading the roses in my front garden, a young woman stopped by the gate. She was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, James Mitchell's daughter. He told me you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities." I set down my pruning shears and walked over to the gate. "What kind of opportunities?" "I work with women who are trying to escape abusive relationships, financial abuse, emotional manipulation, that sort of thing." "Dad said you might understand what they're going through." I thought about the scared, confused woman I'd been just months ago, convinced I was powerless and dependent on the goodwill of people who didn't care about me. "I might," I said. Sarah smiled. "Would you like to hear about what we do?" As we talked, I realized that Floyd's final gift to me hadn't just been financial security. He'd given me something much more valuable, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, smarter than anyone had given me credit for, and capable of protecting myself and others who needed protecting. 2 months later, I established the Floyd Whitaker Foundation for Financial Justice, providing legal support and financial education for victims of family financial abuse. It wasn't the legacy Sydney and Edwin had expected to leave behind, but it was exactly the legacy Floyd would have wanted. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.